There you go, start. Hello and welcome to this new series that I'm presenting on YouTube titled Cinemania, in which I talk to fellow writers, critics and filmmakers about their journey into cinephilia. And my very first guest is a dear friend, colleague, and someone that I admire a lot and whose opinion I always seek out. That's my friend Stefan Pape. Stefan, thank you so much for joining me. This is you are my very first guest on this podcast. So I'm taking this as a really positive thing because I really respect your views. Let me
Cool.
first, can you tell us about you? Introduce yourself, basically.
Cool. Well, firstly, thank you for having me on this podcast. Looking forward to speaking to you today. I just can't believe you trust my opinions. That makes you probably the first person in the world. So I'm a freelancer. I'm obviously very aligned to the movie site, Hey You Guys, where I've been working for a number of years. And I sort of started off doing criticism. I was very much kind of built into the kind of world of film festivals and writing reviews and stuff like that. And then as sort of time sort of progressed, I've really got into interviewing. So I'm now, I guess I'm an interviewer. Critic sounds cooler, but I'd say I'd probably do more interviewing. So yeah, I work for a sort of a number of places really at the moment. I'm sure we'll sort of get into all that sort of stuff. But yeah, I'm a freelance film journalist is
Yeah.
probably the best way to describe
You
me.
did mention your sort of foray into interviewing later in the sort of your career, but which one do you prefer the most, interviewing or reviewing?
It's an interesting one. I prefer reviewing. If I'm completely honest, I came out of uni and I started doing kind of film journalism and I started writing reviews and I loved the buzz of it. I love film festivals. I love going to see a film and then hordes of people leaving the cinema and sitting on their laptops and writing reviews. And I loved seeing my poster quotes, the very occasional times I had star ratings on poster quotes and stuff. But I think the thing is, there's such a huge, vast array of brilliant writers out there. And I found it a little bit hard to stand out from the crowd to monetize it. Because, I mean, that's not to say I wasn't kind of, sort of getting commissions and sort of doing reviews and stuff, but I started getting into interviewing and I kind of realized that it was more, I'm not going to say niche, but it was a smaller circuit
Yeah,
maybe
yeah.
to penetrate. And I felt that there was more chance of me most of my big commissions as a freelancer, you kind of have to just go with the flow. And most of my big commissions that started coming in were just for interviews. And the next thing you know, I'm doing so many interviews and less of reviews, and the kind of the tipping of the scale was just changed somewhat. But my dream and what I love doing was writing reviews. But now I'm, 35 and I've got a mortgage and I have to follow to some degree. So I sort of moved into the interview. But having said that, when an interview goes really well, I absolutely there's not a buzz like it. I guess the difference is with writing a review, it's always on your terms. You dictate the kind of the experience, I suppose, of writing it and finding a nice coffee shop or a nice office at home to kind of sit down and do it. Whereas an interview, the terms are dictated really by who I'm interviewing. So whether it goes well, whether I get that buzz, it's kind of out of my hands, which I suppose makes it more exciting, but it's less of a kind of safe bet.
Is there a fear at all that this is kind of a dying art, the art of critiquing, of reviewing, writing a review rather than like going on video and saying what you think of a movie? Do you think that's dying a bit? Because it does feel almost like every single print outlet out there is just cutting costs or disappearing completely. What do you think is the future?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't say, I mean, I guess maybe dying is one way of putting it. I mean, changing, I mean, certainly moving towards, a more kind of like multimedia kind of sort of experience, I suppose, for kind of consumers. I mean, what is dying and what we're not dying, but what is changing that I'm not so happy about is you'll get someone, and this is no disrespect to these people, because, if people start their own kind of TikTok accounts and stuff like that, where they'll say, here's the 10 best movies out this week and all that. And look, don't get me wrong, it's engaging people. It is if people are wanting to watch it and people are viewing it, then who am I to say that, it's not kind of worthy or anything like that. But the kind of art of feeling like someone it's okay to feel like someone knows a lot more than you. And when
Yeah.
open up a newspaper and I read a review, going back to kind of Philip French, or kind of now you've got the brilliant, Guy Lodge and kind of Jessica Kiang and kind of writers like that. You read their interpretation of a movie and it articulates and tells you things you hadn't quite been able to kind of figure out. And I find it such an incredible kind of creative art form that where I kind of want to be in awe of the writer. I want to think I want them to make references to 50s French cinema. Then I go and feel like they've come from a real place of knowledge and, was it the whole we don't trust experts thing? And I think that the whole of society, not just in film, is moving towards this kind of lack of trust for experts. I love experts, and I feel like you only really get experts in that kind of written form in the Sight and Sounds and Varieties and Guardians or whoever. I mean, that's not to say there aren't brilliant and experts doing, TikTok accounts or Instagram reels and stuff, but I feel like the kind of there's so many of the kind of world's best sort of writers are still in that kind of print format, and it's trying to preserve. I say print format. I also mean online reading, kind of
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
variety online. I mean more the written word. So I do fear it's changing, but I'm not sure it's dying. I think it's one of those things where if it was to actually die
Mm.
and it was to disappear, I think there'd be such a clamour for it to return.
Oh
But I
yeah,
think
yeah,
it's
yeah, definitely.
always exist in some capacity, but it is changing. It is going down towards more of a kind of, and I think headlines are getting more clickbaity and stuff. So I think the whole culture of film
So
criticism.
let's say you're more optimistic than pessimistic about it. Does it feel like by it disappearing, the only people who are able to sort of hang on to their jobs are people who are really, really good at writing about film?
It does. I think that's the one thing that it does feel a bit like the walls kind of close in, and and how many actual paid jobs where you could make an actual living wage in London, for example,
Yeah.
as in that being your only thing, as in like I mean, you almost feel like there's what maybe in the UK 10 or 20 of those positions at the moment. I feel like there's so few of those kind of roles because like, but then. There's other roles where, when you go onto the kind of junket scene, you go to screenings now, there'll probably be 50 people in a room that are all making a kind of decent wage and living off this career, just in a kind of different capacity. They're doing bulletins or kind of, they're making sort of 2-minute video review things. And like I said, there's value in all of that. I'm not going to come on here and belittle. It isn't just like, oh, but if it's not written by Philip French, I don't want to read. I don't
No,
feel
no, I
that
get
way.
what you're saying. Yeah,
Value to all types of criticism. I
yeah,
just think that there's a kind of experience of sitting down and reading something where I just think you can't sort of change that, or you can't kind of better that for me.
yeah. Right. Let's sort of talk about more personally, things that are a bit more personal to you. I think these are questions I'm going to try and ask every single guest that I have on, which is what has been your journey into cinephilia? Let's start from a very young age. What was the one film, one director, one actor, one genre that really made you want to be part of this business?
Well, I think when I was really young, growing up, I really loved Robin Williams films. That was my kind of when I was really young. I mean, I had a lot of friends that were kind of went more down their kind of Arnold Schwarzenegger kind of route, when they were my age. And I loved kind of Terminator and sort of True Lies and stuff like that. But I loved more. I always was quite into light films. But to be honest with you, when it came to kind of wanting to do this as a career, it very much came for me. I'm not going to say, well, not self-taught, but it's not academic. I didn't really study film necessarily, but I loved going to the cinema, mostly with my mum and dad. My mum and dad had always been very inventive and quite brave in some of the things they'd take me to see. I remember they went to go and see The Apartment, the sort of
Oh,
Jack
brilliant.
Lemmon, Billy Wilder film, but I was only about 10. And I remember when we got there, I always remember because I was 10, I think I was with my brother and my cousin who would have been like 9 and 8 years old.
Mm.
And I remember the person there selling tickets said thank you to my mum, as in like, oh my God, thank you so much for bringing kids to see this. And I remember thinking like, what's my mum doing that's different to like,
Mm.
and realised actually it was quite novel that we go to the National Film Theatre a lot. And she took me to see Les Enfants de Paradis, which is a kind of
Oh,
1980s French sort of, film. And I guess at the age of 12 or 13 at school, there weren't many kids, but they were kind of, I go to school and everyone was like, well, you know, have you seen the new Fast and Furious? And I know, no, I went to see Les Enfants du Paradis. So I had quite an eclectic, and that's not to say it was kind of snobby. I mean, we'd maybe go to see an old film once a year or something. It wasn't like every weekend I was there. But my mum and dad used to. I think they were in. They're big cinephiles, so they'd want to go and see these films because they'd want to go and see them. They'd basically just sort of take us along. So I got to see a lot of films that way. But in terms of wanting to do it as a career, to be honest, that came a bit later. I was at school doing my was it the A levels or GCSEs? Anyway, it was I took media studies, and I had to do an essay or like a kind of it was an essay, piece of coursework, whatever, where I had to compare the way Britain was represented in Four Weddings and a Funeral and The Full Monty. I loved writing about it, and I was one of those kids at school. It took a lot for me to be engaged. And I remember just really enjoying it, and I got like an A or something, and it was like the only A I got that year. And there was something about analyzing film that just really tapped into something. But even then, when I went to uni, I studied journalism. I always came into this with a journalistic point of view as opposed to a film studies. I know there's a bit of a, I'm not going to say disconnect, but there's kind of two paths, I think, into doing what we do, you know, which is kind of you get people that do film studies, so they learn, you know, and they'll watch all the kind of Truffaut, Bergman, and they'll really study the kind of the kind of intricacies and the kind of texture of cinema. But I came into it from a kind of journalistic point of view to try and not to say like, oh, I want to try and break stories, but I came into it in terms of kind of trying to. I enjoyed writing rather than analyzing so much,
Yeah.
which is so to begin with anyway. So I never really came into it as a kind of. I hate the word film. When I say film geek, that's not a. I don't mean that as a criticism. I am a film geek, but I never came into it in a kind of as a sort of in an academic kind of theoretical way. It always kind of was something I wanted to do to make a career out of.
Yeah.
But in terms of my sort of personal sort of like love for film, I mean, I've just sort of always loved film. I think it's. I mean, it's sort of one of those things. It almost feels like you say, I almost love eating or I almost love breathing. You know, most people you speak to will say they love films growing up. And I'm no different to anyone when it came to sitting down and watching all the Disney films as a kid over and over again, or being able to mouth every word to Home Alone when I was about 8 years old, which I was able to do. I've forgotten now. So I wasn't any to other people in that regard, really. But I've always had a passion for cinema and storytelling. Yeah.
I think when you speak about the difference between geekdom and being a fan of films, I think there is a huge difference. I think geekdom doesn't require any kind of sort of intelligent, trying to intelligently interpret what the film is telling you. I think loads of people who are film geeks are film geeks, and that's that. And I just, not to be like a disparaging or anything, I'm just trying to sort of to explain. I think there's a huge difference between cinephilia and geekdom. Would you say that as well?
Yeah, and I'd certainly say that I prefer reading articles and hearing the thoughts of people that come into it from the latter. I think, you know, I do. I mean, I think that it's interesting. I think there are different. I think there is I think there is a slight disconnect and there is a difference, but I don't think there can't be crossover at the same time. I think someone could be a huge cinema geek or complete, you know, Spider-Man fanatic, but it doesn't stop them being able to offer kind of, you know, sort of more academic and sort of like words and opinions or kind of other sort of properties or other films. But I do think it's interesting being in this industry. I think not being really geeky about certain films sets you in quite good stead. I've never been one of those people that feels like I have to see films first or I have to, because you see that you can get a lot of critics and stuff with people in the industry where they're so kind of emotionally invested in certain properties that they almost like they have to see it first. And sometimes, you know, and I think that coming into from a journalistic point of view, I sort of follow things a little bit more on kind of like what's needed career wise, and I think that can sort of set you in quite good stead from a professional point of view. But having said that, you know, I do remember going to the Force Awakens when that first came on and being in a room full of geeks, I suppose, of which I'm one. seeing the kind of the Star Wars kind of intro come up, and even I got a little tingle. So maybe we're all geeks at heart, even if we kind of don't say we are.
I am glad you said that about wanting to be like the first to see something. At a point, it just becomes like a competition and who's first. And it kind of like takes away from your love for cinema sometimes. And I think I did find myself in that situation at one point when even films that I wasn't really that keen on or interested, like franchises like the Marvel franchises, you almost felt like you'd been sort of set aside if you weren't invited first to the first screening of it, and that you found yourself like becoming the person who you despise the most. So, were you ever sort of influenced by any of that?
No, I've always been, to be honest with you, I've always been quite, I've always looked at this from a very kind of, I've never really been influenced by that so much. I've always come into this industry and come into these kind of situations where you are able to see things first and you do have that kind of privilege without ever, I've never really been one that moans a lot. And I'm not saying that people do moan a lot, but the kind of the culture of like, oh, well, how come I wasn't invited, or how come I wasn't able to do this? I've always just been a bit more kind of like, what will be about stuff. And the way I see it, if you really want to see a film, you'll get to see it eventually. It's going to come out. So no, but I've never really been someone like that. I mean, look, maybe I should have been. Maybe it would have got me a few more commissions. But it's just my personality. I've always been a bit kind of more relaxed about that
Yeah,
sort of
yeah.
thing.
I think that's the best way to be honest. Um, what about directors wise? First favorite director, and the first film you saw of them.
Good question. I mean, the thing is, obviously, when you're a kid, well, when I was sort of really young, a lot of my sort of favorite directors I wouldn't have really known actually so much about the kind of concept of a directive,
Oh, yes.
especially look at kind of people, look Christopher Columbus and, and John Hughes and people like that making movies. But I didn't connect the movies when I was a kid. I didn't know really that the guy who had written and kind of made Home Alone had also written, did he do Mrs. Doubtfire? John Hughes, have I got that? Yeah.
Don't use it maybe I don't know.
Yeah.
Let's have a little Google. Here it's here. If I had an editor, if I had
Yeah.
a technician behind me, I'd just go. Can you pull that up? But I can't. I'll have to look it up myself.
Yeah, I know. For example, I know he did obviously planes, trains, and automobiles. For example, I don't think. No, I'm thinking of. Sorry, I'm thinking of Chris Columbus, who did Mrs. Doubtfire.
Yeah, Chris Columbus. Yeah, he did Mrs. Doubtfire.
Because Chris Columbus would have done Mrs. Doubtfire, and he also did Home Alone. I think
Yeah,
that's right.
yeah, yeah.
So, but when I was a kid, even though I loved those two films to pieces, I wouldn't have known it was the same person. So I'd say I started getting into directors a bit late, and it was when I got to school I became a really big fan of Shane Meadows. That was like my entry into like sort of more independent kind of thing. Because I guess when you're a kid, it's always very kind of built around what the new Disney films are and all the films with favorite actors in it. But in terms of my favorite, I mean, I was very aware of, I really got into Scorsese as a teenager.
Wow.
And I know, like I remember that was a bit self-taught. I remember I sort of took myself off and just watched kind of Raging Bull and kind of King of Comedy and Mean Streets and did all of them. And he was one of the first directors that I started to respect their full body of work and see myself as a real fan towards them. I know it's an obvious answer,
Well,
but
it's
the
not
other
an
one,
obvious answer. I mean, Scorsese, as you know, is my favorite director of all time, and I will love anyone who says they love his work. And I don't think it's an obvious answer. I think loads of people who love Scorsese will only just say, "I like Goodfellas" or "I like Taxi
yeah,
Cab,"
true.
but they've not really looked into the other more sort of complex stuff that he does.
I've
Yeah.
got more. I mean, the other really big one, and I think I'm not sure if this kind of came from growing up with a Jewish mother, but
Mm,
I mean, it's not the most popular name to say these days, but it doesn't change my history and my relationship with his work. But Woody Allen was huge in my house. I mean,
same.
that was someone where I think that was one where my mum felt compelled to make me a fan. I mean, she would literally sit me down and try and get me to watch all the films. And it took me a while to kind of get into more of the kind of later kind of Hannah and her sisters kind of work and stuff like that. But even as a youngster, I mean, Play It Again, Sam, I loved Play It Again, Sam, and a sort of more of the kind of it's more yeah, more of his comedic work, lighter work, and more slapstick stuff I loved when I was younger. But Woody Allen was another director that I had a really great affinity towards when I was younger. Yeah, I mean, that was it's just it's when you realise you start recognizing they have a body of work, and they have a linearity, or they have a kind of a through line that
Mhm.
connects. Yeah, it's when you start acknowledging that, when you start watching a film and you go, God, that feels like a Scorsese film, you realize you're becoming aware of their work. So I guess Scorsese and Woody Allen are the two that stand out. I mean, obviously I loved other filmmakers when I was young. I mean, like I said, Chris Columbus, and I loved John Hughes movies and stuff when I was really young. And Spielberg, I mean, E.T. and and Jurassic Park. I mean, actually, bloody hell. I should have prepared. Spielberg, who's 100% the first, yeah. E.T., Jurassic Park, and Jaws when I was a kid.
Well,
I
I
mean,
didn't want
they.
you preparing because I wanted like whatever is inside you to come out. I think that's the best way. And it's nice to sort of figure it out as we do it. Um, First on-screen crush, whether be it male or female.
Well, if you really want to go back, I used to really fancy Nala from Lion. When I was like 5 or 6, I used to really fancy Nala. I kind of appreciate that wasn't quite doable. I, I'd say I mean there's a couple that come to mind. God, I was going to sound like a right creep because I remember really fancying Jessica Rabbit as well from Who Framed Roger
Oh
Rabbit.
yeah,
No,
everyone did.
my first like crush, and the first time I remember like fancying someone on screen, and I don't think there's anything wrong with fancying someone on screen. If I think it's something there's something especially when you're younger, like the idea of finding someone, so stupidly beautiful, completely out of reach, is part of the kind of beguiling kind of connection we sometimes form with kind of movie stars and kind of and movies as well. But my first one that I remember was Cameron Diaz in The Mask.
Oh yeah.
I I think that was the first time I ever. I think also it wasn't. It's the first time you kind of acknowledge the kind of you can fancy people not just because when you're at school you might fancy your sort of classmates and all that sort of stuff, and then you kind of realize I fancy someone because they're on screen and they're sexy. It's sort of a kind of I guess it's that kind of awakening. What's the word? Kind of coming of age kind of period you kind of go through where you start sort of realizing you have these different desires. And yeah, Cameron Diaz in The Mask is the one that comes to mind.
Let's go back to talking about the current state, current discourse around film, especially around award season. Obviously, we've had the Oscar nominations this week, and not everyone seems to be happy about certain categories. And what are your views on the omission of Greta Gerwig and of Margot Robbie? Um,
Honestly, my view, because Barbie got 8 nominations,
mm,
and I think it's so rare for a blockbuster, a light-hearted blockbuster like that, which is connected to a kind of a different property. So you get films from like Hasbro and stuff like that. And this obviously has come from the kind of Mattel, isn't it? That kind of done it's kind of based on the kind of toy. And films like that generally they just don't tend to be in the mix. And I think the fact it got 8 nominations, when I saw all the nominations come through. My first reaction was, "Oh, amazing! Barbie got 8 nominations. How good!" And then I went online thinking everyone was going to be saying, "Oh, how great is this?" Everyone was like getting really angry and stuff, and I just don't think. Look, I think just before I sort of go up on one, I think Greta Gerwig did a fantastic job tonally with that movie. It manages to be self-deprecating and empowering, and it manages to be frivolous and kind of like frivolous, and at the same time self-aware and kind of like it's a real brilliant piece of direction. I think the same again for Margot Robbie. I think it's a really brilliant performance. It's very understated. She's kind of carrying this kind of existential crisis in the kind of form of a kind of doll that is traditionally doesn't have like emotions or human feelings. So she's got this kind of really interesting, quite subtle performance. And I actually think the two of them are brilliant. However, I think the one thing that nobody seems to have kind of taken into consideration when they're criticizing the Academy is that maybe they missed out because other people did a better job. And it's like no one seems to be entertaining that. People just seem to just say, well, that's that it's that they weren't chosen because it's it's the patriarchy, or it's a film that was too the film had a very great feminist value, so they were
yeah.
never going to get think there has to be this kind of underlying reason. But actually, the reason could just be it was an incredibly competitive year. It's one of the best picture nomination lists I've seen in such a long time. All 10 films are great. And I can say that because I finally saw American Fiction today, which is my last one of the
Oh,
film.
great movie.
Now, so I've now done all 10. And no one seems to just be opening their eyes to the possibility. I know it's a novel idea that maybe the 5 directors they got in over over Greta Gerwig just were also brilliant. And they really were. And I think people get a bit stumped if you say to them, who would you take out? And people look at the list and they go, and I think Greta Gerwig missing out is more a reflection of just how brilliant a year it was for cinema, to be honest. I really do. And I mean, you look at some of those names in there, you know, from Yorgos Lanthimos to Jonathan Glazer, you know, obviously, you know, Justin Triet as well. Who's the last one? Who am I missing? There's one more. Oh, Scorsese.
Scorsese,
Yeah.
of course. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, I think there might be another way. Anyway, all of those films are brilliant and brilliantly directed, and I think that's just. And so I think I'm trying not to get too caught up in the kind of discourse because you know, I don't want to. I'm very aware of that. I am a man talking about Barbie, and I don't want to sort of feel like I'm kind of,
no,
you know,
you're
sort
not.
of
No. No, I agree. I
over.
agree. I agree with everything you've just said. Finally, I'm going to ask you one last question, and that is, what is your most controversial film opinion?
God, most
Hard,
controversial.
I know.
Oh, that is quite hard. What? I'm trying to think of it because I'm
What
it's
film
the
that is really either hated or really loved that you've gone completely the opposite direction?
thing. This is good. Yeah, this could take a while. No, I
I'll take all
controversial.
the time you need.
All my friends wind me up. Oh gosh, and all my friends wind me up for being a fence sitter. I'm one of those people. I'm always like, I try and see the good in everything. So it's more likely that I love something that people hate rather than the other way around. Because when everyone sort of hates something, I'm always like, oh well, I think it's actually quite good. I controversial film opinions. I I wouldn't say it's is that controversial. I'm just trying to think of different genres and stuff like that. This is going to take a while. What's controversial? What's if you give me what would you say yours is? If I hear yours, it might.
Mine is I have never seen Titanic, and I intend to never see Titanic because I think it's a load of old shite, and it's not a film that I ever want. I've ever been interested in seeing or want to see, but that's controversial, and that's going to get me loads of hate mail. There you go.
I think it's not controversial. I was going to say I think that that's not a controversial take. I was going to say that I think. Well, I tell okay, this is controversial. I think if you look, it's not controversial. I think it's more people are going to think I'm stupid if I say this. I think that in the last 20 years, Step Brothers could be in the top 5 films.
Oh, love it. Great movie.
That's not controversial. It's more just that I think it's more that's about looking at how I think comedies maybe are undervalued in the kind of wider world. But I've not. There's a few films I've not seen that I'm very embarrassed about. I've never seen Fight Club.
Oh,
Like I should have seen Fight Club by
no.
now. I hate ensemble films. It's not very controversial. These are just opinions. I'm just
Yeah,
not.
yeah.
I'm tired of controversy. I might just end up eating.
Even the Robert Altman style
Hmm.
ensemble movies.
Just there's something about ensemble films. There's loads and loads of people, and there's loads of narratives going on at the same time. I just never like it. I
Okay.
never been. But no, there's not much controversy with me. I'm a pretty boring person in that regard. Maybe I need to start hating things more.
You're not. Right. Okay. Thank you so much, Stefan, for being my first guest, and thank you for your always on point opinions, and for sort of, having honestly, I always look out for your opinions on anything, and I always find myself in agreement with you. So thank you again. So yeah, this was our first episode, and I've got a really good list of people coming on in the next few episodes. So keep watching, subscribe, and follow us. And yeah, thank you so much again for being part of this. And
Cool.
yeah,
Yeah,
goodbye.
brilliant.
Bye.
To do, but I found the reaction mad, to be honest. I think I put 8 nominations is really good, but